Everybody, this is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. On behalf of our entire Wisconsin Facets staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is entitled Inclusive Strategies to Address the Behavioral Needs of Students with IEPs. Our presenters today are Tim Pierenboom and Eva Shaw. Prior to joining DPI, Tim served as a school psychologist, an autism specialist, and director of special education and pupil services. He has experience working with children aged 3 to 21 in a variety of public education service models in urban, rural, and suburban school districts. Eva is a special education consultant at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. Her role focuses on supports for students with IEPs with neurodiverse needs. She has worked in the field of special education for over 25 years and has had the privilege to serve children, families, and schools in several states and a variety of different roles. It is my pleasure today to introduce to you both Tim and Eva.
Thank you, Bonnie. This is Eva, and today we're going to talk about inclusive strategies to address the behavioral needs of students with IEPs. Our objectives today are that you'll become familiar with some strategies to support students who present with behaviors that may be challenging to the adults in school settings. And we'll also be sharing some additional resources that can be found on the Wisconsin DPI webpage to address the behavioral needs of students with IEPs. As we get started, I want to share some data that supports the need for more equitable, culturally competent, effective, and inclusive practices to address the behavioral needs of students with IEPs. So why do we need to develop more inclusive strategies? If you take a look at this information on this slide, you'll see that during the 2018-2019 school year, students with IEPs were removed for approximately 53,000 school days due to out-of-school suspensions. Students as young as 3 are being suspended out of school, and there was even one kindergarten student who was expelled due to some behavioral issues. In Wisconsin, if we look at our statewide data for students who are most often removed from classrooms, you'll see that in Wisconsin, there's some disproportionality or racial bias in who gets suspended. You'll notice that our Black students are 6.7 times more likely to receive a disciplinary removal from white students than white students, while Native Americans are 2.0 times more likely than white students, and Hispanic students are 1.9 times more likely to experience a disciplinary removal. And the urgency to reduce exclusionary practices and develop more inclusive strategies is really highlighted by the fact that even one instance of suspension from school is predictive of future suspensions and a greater likelihood of dropping out of school. We also know that students impacted by trauma are suspended and expelled at higher rates than other students. So despite research that shows that exclusionary practice can bring long-term negative effects for students and can actually cause harm and do little or nothing to change behavior that interferes with learning, schools in Wisconsin continue this practice. So here are some questions for us to reflect on that. So what is the purpose of suspensions and what is achieved? What is achieved from 3 days of suspension that can't be achieved in 1? Thinking about what is the impact of removal on students, on their academic performance, on their social and emotional well-being, on their sense of belonging. And then thinking about what other actions can we take to better support the behavioral needs of students. So Tim, do you want to move into taking a look and reflecting on some behavior bias in adult practice?
Sure thing. So, yeah, I just wanted to give a minute for reflection there. Some of the data that Eva just shared is, just a little snippet of what we know about exclusionary practices and disciplinary practices when it comes to disproportionality and the impact on not only the students that are removed, but the adults and the whole school community in general. And what we're learning more and more is that these types of practices are not supportive of the student or helpful to the school community, even when we think of things like, well, if we remove the student from the class, then the rest of the kids aren't being distracted and interrupted. And we're starting to learn that that's just not true. So really good questions to reflect on and think about to sort of give us a basis for why we're talking today about ways to be more inclusive of students who receive services through an IEP. So the first thing we need to talk about when it comes to supporting students with IEPs are the behaviors and biases that we as adults bring to our schools or to our homes. So when we think about social, emotional, behavioral challenges, the first thing to recognize is that schools are not like laboratories. They're not really controlled settings where we can control all the variables that impact students' behavior. They have all sorts of factors that impact both how we as adults behave and act and speak and things we do and interact, and that kids do as well. So one of the main influences on our students' behavior is us as grown-ups and how we behave. So it's important to remember that as adults, it's also important to remember that as adults, we have limitations in terms of what we have control over in those sort of environments that are structured but not as controlled as, like I said, a laboratory might be. So the first step in really being able to provide truly inclusive practices and services to students is looking at our own biases and beliefs about student behavior, as well as the social norms and things that are part of the school and the school community and the larger community where the school is. So questions to ask are things like, are we attributing behavioral challenge? What are we attributing behavioral challenges to? Do we ascribe more blame for challenging behaviors on the child or the student? Or do we consider that children, like all humans, react to the environment that's around them? And then how do we address those behaviors when they occur? So often terms like challenging and inappropriate and disruptive, even things like aggressive, are used to describe the behavior of a child without an examination of how bias and our social norms and what we as adults and educators bring to the table bring to and have an impact on the decision-making processes that go on in school on a day-to-day basis. These differences in beliefs can lead to significantly different responses. And that is sort of the real potential harm of the biases that we as adults carry with us. So you can see one example on the slide that shares an example of a race-based form of bias. Two students engaging in the same behavior, and the response is both labeled differently by the adult, disruptive versus an expression of an unmet need, and also responded to differently. So responded to in a more punitive, disciplinary way, as opposed to providing more support. And if you're skeptical about, like, does this really happen? It is borne out by research. So we know that Black boys, by adults, by teachers, by law enforcement, they're perceived as older, more aggressive, and angrier than their white peers, even as children as young as 10 years old. So those are some of the biases or the implicit biases that adults can bring to these situations that this example highlights. And it's also important to recognize that this isn't just limited to race. I've worked in rural school districts where behavior is often attributed to where somebody lives, like, oh, they live over in the trailer park and we know their family and that's how this student acts, and that's the reason for that behavior. We also know that data suggests children with disabilities also face sort of barriers due to implicit biases and adult behaviors around them. This is especially true for students labeled with emotional behavioral disability. And if you think about it, it's really these biases, these things, you can see them. It's really, it's embedded in our language a lot of times. If you hear people just say terms like, boys will be boys, while girls are, they're filled with sugar and spice and everything nice. So these sort of biases are there. They're in our language. There's research and data to support that they're there. So we're glad you're all here today to hear about some of the things we have to talk about in terms of inclusive practices. Schools and districts these days, they almost always have some sort of system or structure set up for supporting students who are experiencing barriers to their learning. They have lots of different names. They might be called response to intervention teams or RTI teams, problem solving teams, child study teams, PBIS teams, which is positive behavior intervention support team, student support teams. So regardless of the name, it's really vital for the adults to recognize and interrupt biases, whether they're implicit or explicit. So DBI was able to partner with Dr. Marquita Newell from the University of Loyola in Chicago. And she shares a framework that we can use to recognize how bias shows up in our discussions about students. And that is ways that we might attribute a cause of an undesired behavior that we need to reframe. So reframing is an important step here. And the way Dr. Newell frames it for us is our problem-solving teams really need to avoid either unfounded, untrue, or unalterable attributions to student behaviors. So an unfounded attribution is one for which there's no evidence. So someone says, oh, this student so-and-so is just lazy. They just don't work very hard, or their parents don't care about the kid's education. You need to ask what the evidence for that is, because in almost all cases, or literally all cases, that's going to be an unfounded attribution to behavior. An untrue attribution is, again, something that's simply just not true. Saying that a student is not achieving because they come from a low-income family. That, again, is not something that's really ever true. Untrue attributions can also be positively framed. So, oh, that student is good at math because they are Asian American. That's just, again, another thing that's just not true. It's based on a stereotype. Another way to look at it that's shared by Dr. Newell is that anytime a person's identity is blamed for or attributed to causing a problem, it's simply untrue. And then unalterable attributions are things that we can't change. So attributing student struggles because they have a disability, or because their parents are divorced, or because of other family factors. Again, those are unalterable attributions that we can't do anything about. So it doesn't serve anyone to spend time on trying to talk about or address those things. So the untrue, unfounded, unalterable attributions, they can be particularly problematic in the decision-making process. So if the problem-solving teams, which would include IEP teams, allow attributions to influence the decisions, it's going to directly impact the child. So Dr. Newell refers to these as vulnerable decision points. So I'd encourage you all to jump into this link, this culturally responsive problem-solving framework. It allows problem-solving teams to sort of focus on ensuring that bias does not influence just the decision-making process during these decision points. And again, vulnerable decision points are those contextual events or elements that increase the likelihood of bias affecting the decision-making. By identifying the vulnerable decision points or times and contexts where the decisions are more likely to be influenced by bias, educators, parents, teams can take steps to introduce that process and make decisions based on objective information, and information that's fair and appropriate for all students. So just to sort of reiterate an earlier comment, to say it in sort of a different way about the laboratory, is kids' behavior doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's influenced by all the things that go on around them, and vice versa. So the behaviors that we interact with that come from children influence how we respond to them, and it becomes this cycle, and that can either lead to a very negative cycle or a coercive cycle, and that's bad. So the example of a child throwing a tantrum in the grocery store, a parent may give in and give them what they want just to stop the tantruming. The child learns tantruming means I get what I want. And then the adult learns, the parent learns, I can make this unpleasant tantrum or this embarrassment in the middle of the grocery store go away by giving into this. And of course, as parents, we all sort of had those moments where that happens, but if it becomes the pattern, that's when it becomes problematic. So the onus is really on the parents or the adults in schools, the educators, to sort of disrupt this pattern. It's not easy. It takes patience and focus and tolerance and some understanding or recognition that we as the adults, we're the ones with the fully developed brains. We're the ones that need to have the maturity that we can use to sort of influence how our children's brains develop through changing our behavior and our responses to them. Using our knowledge and skills and experiences to adjust the environment around kids to set them up in an environment that sets them up for success. One of my favorite quotes when I think about treating behavioral needs in the same way we treat academic needs is, I don't know who to attribute this quote. It's pretty ubiquitous now, so you might be familiar with it, but it goes something like, when kids struggle to write or learn to write, we teach them. When kids struggle to learn to read, we teach them. And when kids struggle to do math, we teach them. But when kids struggle to behave in the way we want them, what do? We punish. How you finish answering that last statement, when kids struggle to behave, we ... really says a lot about our biases and beliefs as adults. So put another way, can you imagine a teacher saying to a first grader who's struggling to read, well, it's very disrespectful that you didn't learn from me how to read yet. We can't put everything on the kid. They're still growing, they're still developing. It's so important to remember that kids do well if they can. They want to do the best they can for the adults around them that care for them. And we can help kids be their best selves and do the best they can by removing those barriers for them, or help them remove those barriers. So again, as the adults with the fully developed brains, it's on us to remove those barriers by identifying the skills that a student needs to improve, providing the support and instruction they need to address those skills, and to monitor their progress as they're learning and developing skills that we want them to have. This next slide mainly a summary of what I've been discussing so far. But there's a couple of things here that I'd like to point out. A reminder that behavior is a form of communication. And again, it's on us as the grown-ups with our fully developed brains, as we're helping kids develop their brains, that we're the ones that are more capable of critical thinking and analysis and problem solving. So it's on us to figure out when a student's behaving a certain way, whether they're physically acting out or withdrawing, whatever their behaviors might be. It's on us to figure out what they're trying to tell us and what we need to do to support them. And to do that, we need to recognize that this communication occurs within a context. Different settings come with different expectations. Imagine trying to, let's say as an adult, trying to complete a decathlon if you're not an athlete, and by someone just handing you all the equipment that you're going to use and says, go do a decathlon. So each event has these different skills and requires different, and is in a different environment, requires different guidance and different practice. And so sometimes I feel like we ask kids, just to figure out all the nuances and demands of their day when they go from class to class or activity to activity, from recess and lunch back to class, with only a few guideposts about our expectations, as opposed to, more specific things that a student might need. So thinking about the social demands and the expectations of the school day, I mean, even for us as adults, those things change by the hour, if not by the minute. So that's, again, just some important things for us as adults to keep in mind. To start us off, a few strategies to start thinking about mindsets and how to change adult mindsets. to create a positive learning adult environment for all students is modeling and integrating social emotional learning into the school day. It is really important. It supports the needs of all students. And it's important, a side note, again, if we're thinking about adult behavior, social emotional learning competencies that are linked on this slide, they go through adulthood. We still, as adults, continue to learn and develop social emotional skills. And if the adults in our environment are not modeling those things, you know, it's important to take a look at that and consider why the adults around kids are not modeling the things that we want or expect our kids to do. That might be a climate and culture issue amongst the adults in the environment, as opposed to any sort of deficits or delays or concerns about the children themselves. Engaging students in developing their own goals and strategies to better meet their needs. You know, kids will be more motivated to change their own behavior if they have a say in what that is and how to go about doing that. So the collaboration, again, involving kids, they'll be more self-motivated, more internally motivated. And that collaboration should focus on what the student can do, as opposed to what they should not do or what we want them to stop doing. Teaching students what's expected of them. Yeah, these skills need to be explicitly taught. Kids don't develop good manners just naturally. They learn it from watching us as adults. They learn it from listening to us as adults. They learn it from practicing them with us as adults as guides for them. So just like teaching a new academic skill, it can take time for students to learn these new skills. And kids are it's important to remember kids are individuals who develop at different rates and in different areas of development. So again, just some questions for you to reflect on, to think about, or to start a conversation about how to sort of get into starting to address shifting adult mindsets, which is, again, an important first step in shifting our adult practices. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it back over to Eva.
Would you mind if we had a question at this time? Okay.
Sure.
The question that we have says, sometimes it's really hard for parents and professionals to change their mindsets because they take the behavior of the child personally. Do you have some suggestions about how to separate not being as personally involved?
Yeah, I wish it were as simple as, don't take things personally, but, adults are human too. So I think the best advice I could give would be, there are strategies you can use to try and not take things personally. In the moment is when it's really, really hard to not take things personally. I know when my 4-year-old gets upset and, hits me, or one of his favorite phrases is mean dada. It's hard to not take that personally in the moment. So what I try and do, and a lot of these strategies can help with that, is you want to do as many proactive things as you can to be prepared for those situations and understand that it's not personal. Another thing I describe to parents or teachers who struggle with not taking things personally is to remember, again, that kids are still developing, and that the higher our emotions sort of escalate, the less sort of logic and control our brain has in those situations. So it's important to remember, like, to not take it personally, knowing that that child or that student, it's coming from emotion. It's not coming from them thinking through what the adult is doing and what they think of it. It's an emotional reaction. So being prepared as best you can prior to the situation, managing a sort of escalated situation as best you can, and then reflecting on it and just reminding yourself that it's not something that you could take personally. or you should take personally. Now that said, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't reflect on that and think about things that you might have done differently or could have done differently to avoid that situation in the future, or to make that situation go smoother in the future, or to help that child or that student navigate that situation better the next time they experience it. And
That's
Eva,
all
I
I
don't know
have
if you
right
have
now. Yep, that's all I have right now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Okay, so we're going to move on to, I guess it kind of goes along with the question about, taking things personally, because as adults, we're examining and addressing our own biases and beliefs, about student behavior, about race or ability, about socioeconomic status or other factors. We have to reflect on and be very purposeful in establishing those meaningful and authentic relationships with students. Strong and healthy adult-child relationships are so important for long-term success for kids. These relationships are necessary to draw students into the process of learning and to promote their desire to learn. And it is our responsibility, the adult's responsibility, to it's not the student's responsibility, it's our responsibility to put forth the effort to build these strong and healthy relationships, which are really critical to students' academic and social development. And we're going to just briefly touch on a couple of ways that we as adults can do that. Excuse me. So a review of educational research, educational research analysis of 46 studies found that strong student-teacher relationships were associated in both the short-term and long-term with improvements on practically every measure that schools care about, like higher student academic achievement, better attendance, better grades, fewer disruptive behaviors and suspensions, and lower school dropout rates. So these strong and healthy relationships really improve everything we want to see to help students be successful. And these effects were strong even after controlling for differences in students' individual, family, and school backgrounds. So knowing that, one of the ways that adults can really be purposeful and build relationships is by using the 6 principles of compassionate instruction. And this comes from the Heart of Learning and Teaching, which was written and compiled by the by the Washington Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction and Western Washington University staff. And it really provides some specific strategies to improve students' education and learning outcomes by creating safe and supporting learning environments, again, from the adults. So the 6 principles of compassionate instruction are listed there on the slide. And if you click on the link, it goes into each of those even in more depth. So remembering to always empower, oops, sorry about that, to provide unconditional positive regard, to maintain high academic and behavioral expectations. Again, like Tim was sharing earlier, to really check our assumptions, to observe and question, to be a relationship coach, to really foster those relationships, and to provide guided opportunities for helpful participation. Another way that adults can really help to build strong and healthy relationships with the children in our lives, the students in our lives, is to foster empathy. We as adults really need to foster empathy for and with our students, with the children in our lives, in order to better address any behavior that interferes with learning. So studies show that when adults think empathetically instead of punitively about the behavior that interferes with learning, we cultivate better relationships and help reduce discipline problems. One way to build empathy is for adults to use active listening so that we really hear the perspective of the student. So active listening really requires the listener to be fully engaged and attentive, to fully concentrate on what is being said, not what our response is going to be, and then reflect back and withhold judgment or advice. So when a child is sharing with us, when a student is sharing with us an experience, a strong emotion, anything that they want to share with us, our job is to really truly listen and understand what they're saying. And in that act of trying to fully understand the message of the speaker, we foster those really strong relationships. And that authentic listening really helps an adult take in a student's many stories and experiences and helps to disrupt our biased thinking. So we truly get to know that individual child. Some other resources to help us develop better active listening skills come from Alina Aguilar, and she provides some listening tips and tools in her book, The Art of Coaching, Effective Strategies for School Transformation. And one tool is the Active and Intentional Listening document, which provides ways for us to reflect back what we hear. And we can do that by clarifying, making sure that we're understanding what we're hearing, acknowledging the thoughts or feelings about what's being said, such as bad dada. The reflecting may be, I hear that you're kind of angry right now. Really helping that child to reframe that. Organizing or summarizing ideas of what's being said from the student, and identifying bigger ideas, helping to, maybe identify ideas and check to see if what we're identifying aligns with what the child is feeling and thinking, and then reframing, rephrasing that overall experience for the child, for the student. Another really great resource, Joseph Conkey, who is our Wisconsin statewide coaching coordinator in Wisconsin. He provided readers with different ways of listening in his article called Expansive Listening and Essential Coaching Support. And then the Wisconsin DPI's Disproportionality Technical Assistance Network added a visual representation to accompany the descriptions of expansive listening. And you can see all of these, here, and ways to really help us listen fully to what the student is sharing with us. And these are all resources that you can dig into further. And then finally, similar to what I shared earlier, that 6 principles of compassionate instruction is the Search Institute's developmental relationships framework. So building relationships needs to be really intentional. And again, the onus is on us, the onus is on the adults. And this framework has 5 elements with 20 specific actions to make relationships powerful in a young person's life. They also provide ideas in the Building Developmental Relationships document, and those ideas are for adults, for parents, for teachers, youth program leaders, and young people. It's all about some really great concrete ideas to help us foster those relationships so that we can really get to know children. And like I shared earlier, those relationships then lead to really great success for kids. And as you're digging into the developmental relationships framework, you'll find that they're very similar to the 6 principles in that, it's about expressing care, setting those high expectations, challenging growth, providing support for students, really empowering and advocating for the student, sharing power. Tim had shared that earlier, that it's so much more effective if we really plan along with students in what works and what their needs are, and then expanding possibilities, really helping students connect with ways that broaden their world and broaden their vision of what can come, what can be for them. And then some reflections, just some time, and Tim's better at wait time than I am when it comes to reflections in a virtual world, but just really reflecting on your relationships with a student, your relationship with a child, and thinking, how do you know whether you have a healthy relationship? What are your indicators of a healthy relationship? And how are you truly considering the perspective of that child? And what are the students' indicators of a healthy relationship? And then, how might you create a process to understand your students' views of a healthy relationship, or your children's view of a healthy relationship? And again, really building that truly authentic relationship. And, with some students who really challenge us, it does take our work, our effort to build that relationship when, they're pushing us away, or when they're, not trusting us to build a relationship. So we have to keep at it. It's on us to continue to build those strong and healthy relationships.
Go ahead and pause here to see if Bonnie's got any questions, or
No
to just give
questions
you a minute to.
Yep, no questions at this time.
All right, well, in that case, we will just go ahead and move along. So just to recap real quick, when we're thinking about inclusive practices for students with IEPs, the first thing we need to think about is changing our mindsets as adults. And that is a first step, because all of the rest of the things we're going to talk about today, if they're going to be effective, our mindsets need to change in order to allow us to build those better relationships with students in all those ways that Eva just talked about. So it starts with changing our mindsets and then really building relationships, because of that old, cliche that kids or students don't care what we know as adults until they know that we care. So now we're going to get into some more specifics about different practices, different evidence-based approaches that really have those relationships and those adult mindsets as the foundation for being effective. So it starts with being proactive and positive when it comes to our actual practices or the things we actually implement. If as an adult we're proactive in responding to students' needs, again, they know we care. It helps us build relationships. And that doesn't even cover all the other benefits that that we get as school employees, or as parents, or as groups, as IEP teams, all the benefits that we get when we establish positive relationships. Important to remember, adults, again, we need to model, we need to reinforce, we need to set up opportunities for students to practice new skills, new positive skills. This is another proactive approach. So we've talked about modeling quite a bit already, but again, an important reminder that if kids see us doing something negative, they see us telling them that behavior is okay. So it's so important to model positive social emotional skills and positive behaviors. If they see us do something positive, because they take that in too. And then setting up opportunities for them to practice. This doesn't have to be a really complicated thing. If you look at some of the strategies and things that happen in a social emotional learning framework, greeting students at the classroom door or at the front door of the school, it does all the things. It's modeling positive social emotional behaviors. It provides an opportunity to reinforce the desired behaviors, and it allows an opportunity for kids to practice those behaviors. So it's sort of a triple whammy there, where we get all the things. We model, they get to practice, they get to generalize, and we get to reinforce that behavior. So it can be very simple things that we just embed in our day-to-day activities. So again, that helps the adults, help students generalize the newly learned skills in different contexts and environments. So once we've greeted them at the door, maybe students, as they establish those skills, maybe your students then get to take turns and they get to be the door greeter to expand those skills by interacting with all the other kids in their class. Or adults can, take a walk through the lunchroom and find lots of opportunities to catch kids being good, or to reinforce those social emotional behavioral skills that we want them to see. To be clear, this is sort of a general, broad, universal type approach. These things are not cure-alls. I'm not saying greeting kids at the door every morning is going to address all behavioral challenges that we face throughout the day, but they go a long way for a lot of kids, which allows us to spend the time and energy we need working with the kids who require some more support. On this slide on the left, what you see is an example of what we refer to as a reactive or a negative cycle of responding to behavior. A couple of things to point out about that cycle. Punishment, it doesn't teach new skills. It doesn't teach kids what we want them to do. It doesn't teach them how to meet whatever need that behavior is having through replacement behaviors. It's less effective over the long term when you get into this reactive negative punishment cycle over the long term. If your goal is lasting behavior change, it's important to keep in mind that punishment, while it may temporarily address a behavior, it's ineffective in the long term in shaping desired behaviors. It's also important to remember that adults applying those punishments or other negative consequences in response to student behavior, that's going to damage your relationship with kids. And Eva just got done explaining all the important reasons why relationships are so important. And then each time this cycle repeats, this negative cycle or this punitive cycle repeats, it's again going to further damage that relationship with the adult and with the system they're interacting with, in this case, schools. And that can lead to further opportunity gaps and further marginalization of students who maybe need the most support. And then on the right, we have an alternative to that. We have a more proactive, supportive approach that interrupts that negative cycle. Supportive strategies, they stimulate this repetitive cycle of positive interactions, and they build relationships. They build on and increase more positive interactions and thus more positive outcomes for students. The focus in the model on the right is anticipating a challenge or the challenges a student might face in various learning environments and proactively addressing the student needs. That might be by teaching a new skill, teaching a student to be prepared for a certain situation. It might be removing certain triggers to behavior. The key is it's steps and strategies to be done before the unwanted or undesired behavior even occurs, which again then builds on this cycle of the adults being able to reinforce the positive behavior because they're not reactively dealing with negative behaviors. So again, the more we can repeat this positive cycle, the less harmful it is in situations where we're sort of forced into reactive mode. So in reality, of course, there's times when we don't anticipate everything or can't control the environment completely. So there are going to be times potentially when a student's behavior presents a clear and imminent risk to their safety or the safety of others. So of course we need to react sometimes, but if we have that positive relationship, if the default that the student knows is that positive cycle, the reactive times can be sort of less harmful to that student and less harmful to the relationship that we have with that student because it doesn't happen as often. So when it comes to special education or IEPs, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, requires individual education plan teams or IEP teams to consider the use of positive behavior interventions and supports that address behaviors that interfere with the student's learning and the learning of others. This requirement applies to all students who have an IEP, and it is not dependent on their label or their disability impairment category. So it's not limited to only students who have emotional behavioral disabilities or autism need to have this considered in their IEP. It's all students with an individualized education plan. So it is important to keep this in mind as we're thinking about supporting students, because it's literally a legal requirement to ensure that students have positive strategies and supports to help remove barriers to their learning. It's also important to remember that all students are going to benefit from a more proactive and positive approach and inclusive strategies. They're more effective for our students with IEPs when they're sort of embedded in or part of an equitable multi-level system of support. And what you see on the slide here is our model in the state of Wisconsin for an MLSS or multi-level system of support. It includes having collaborative teams implementing practices that support students' social emotional competence and their academic achievement. It's based on data. So it's based on data-driven decision-making processes, and again, focuses on the adult behavior. When we implement these sort of things systematically and with fidelity, or in the manner that they're designed to be implemented and used, the positive behavior intervention supports really do have a positive impact on student outcomes, both social, emotional, behaviorally, and academically. It's important to note here, as I mentioned, that it helps with both of those outcomes, the social, emotional, behavioral functioning and academics. We're learning more and more through research that those two things are tied together and almost sort of inseparable. So our model isn't two different systems or sets of strategies, one that focuses on academic skills and academic behaviors and academic interventions and assessment and progress monitoring, and then a separate system for social, emotional, behavioral functioning. They're just, those two things are so tied together that we have to look at them together, and that's what we're going to talk about next, is some of the strategies for implementation. So there's several different models within that multi-level system of support that different school districts or different schools might implement. One of them that's pretty prominent in Wisconsin as a systematic process is positive behavior intervention supports. I understand that can be a little confusing because I just talked about the requirements of positive behavior intervention supports being required in the IEP. This is a different system or structure. This is a more universal system that is, even though it uses the same phrase or same title, it is a different system. This is the universal system of ways to systematically support all students, different than the IDEA requirement for those positive behavior intervention supports. So they overlap, they're related, and each of them are going to be part of that multi-level system of support. So this PBIS, the sort of capital PBIS, capital letter PBIS, what it is that it's a system that applies evidence-based programs and practices and strategies universally to increase academic performance, improve school safety, decrease problem behaviors, and really establish a positive school culture. And it does this through a team-based problem-solving process and a systems-wide problem-solving process and data-driven process that looks at systems, data, practices, and outcomes for students. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about that, to visit the Wisconsin RTI Center or the PBIS Network website. For our younger students, another universal system is the pyramid model. This is a model that was developed for supporting our younger students. Much like school-wide PBIS, this model is a framework for implementing culturally responsive, multi-level system of support. And this is designed in a way to enhance social emotional competence in younger children, to promote the development of programs, policies, and practices, and provide early care and early intervention providers with practice-based coaching and supports to ensure that they're implementing the evidence-based practices in those early learning settings, and that they're integrated and used with fidelity. So really those three models that I just discussed, the PBIS, the multi-level system support, the pyramid model, are just examples of ways you can sort of systematically set up systems that support students socially, emotionally, behaviorally. There's more, but we're going to focus on some things now that each of these systems sort of have in common. So what are the actual skills and strategies and things that each of these systems sort of implements in the classroom? And you may have guessed it already, but they are all reliant on adult behavior, adult practices, and relationship building. So the three key adult practices that we're going to go over to help create an inclusive learning environment for students with IEPs are setting and modeling high expectations, establishing routines, and increasing student engagement. So when teachers have high expectations for students, we're giving them things that are high interest, that build self-esteem, that increase confidence, and that can improve academic performance. So students will meet the bars we set for them. When it comes to setting and modeling high expectations, in establishing that culture, we need to not just set high expectations, but we also need to set those up with high levels of support. So we don't just set that bar and say, good luck getting over it. We need to support them in doing it. So to just increase expectations without modeling, without teaching, without supporting the students, it's just going to lead to frustration on everyone's part and most likely failure. We do have a set of social emotional learning competencies that can sort of be a guide for some age appropriate expectations to be setting for students. They can assist in identifying skills that individual students or groups of students might need to be taught explicitly, and that can help students acquire and apply the skills they need to improve access, engagement, and progress in the curriculum and instruction. So again, we don't set high expectations and then sit back and hope the kids meet them. We need to provide explicit instruction. So once we set that high expectations, we need to teach them, kids, how to meet those. So most of the things we do as people, most of the skills children develop or humans develop are sort of a combination of innate skills and learned skills. So when we teach kids to swim, we don't just throw them in the pool and say swim. Instinctually, you might have a child doggy paddle and stay afloat, but to really teach them to swim, we need instruction. We need to explicitly teach those skills. The same can be said for social emotional learning skills. So on your slide here, you see some examples of different evidence-based strategies and things that can be used to teach skills, social skills. We do want explicit instruction to focus on positive strategies that teach and again reinforce new skills and replacement behaviors. It's important to note here the images you see on these slides. These are not things that we at DPI have necessarily vetted or are promoting or are saying are the things that all schools should be doing. There's just too many individual circumstances in schools and districts and classrooms that need to be considered when considering and thinking about what you're going to provide. Again, another example of a tool that can be used for explicit instruction. This one is for self-management or emotional regulation. We provide this tool on our website to proactively teach self-management skills and teach target behaviors. The key here, one of the strongest things here that is in evidence-based practices is self-monitoring. Self-monitoring is really a tried and true evidence-based practice to help students and people in general improve on a wide variety of behaviors and skills. In this case, would be self-management, social emotional regulation. This next practice, establishing routines, seems really simple and obvious in a lot of ways, but it's really important. So just as a quick thought exercise, pause and think about what routines do you rely on to get through your day. For example, my evening routine at home includes cleaning up the kitchen after dinner, helping the kids get ready for bed, getting their clothes and backpacks ready for school the next morning, and certainly most importantly, setting up the coffee maker to auto start in the morning. If I don't do that routine, my morning routine gets thrown off and I can feel it impact my day and me getting into the flow of my workday. So if you sit back and think about it, we establish routines for kids, and this slide shows you some steps for establishing routines for kids, and it's so important because we know academic and social behaviors are taught. They're changed and strengthened through consistent instructional strategies, regardless of what's being taught. So you start with an evidence-based strategy or intervention, and then you match it to student needs. And then the final sort of inclusive strategy is to increase engagement. How is this a inclusive strategy? Well, it's because what we know is, and I don't particularly love this saying, but it's appropriate or accurate here. We know that idle hands are the devil's workshop. So kids who are engaged, who are busy in learning activities that they're enjoying, that they're getting things out of, that they are able to focus on, then they're not doing things like being disruptive or getting up out of their seat or being distracted. So if we can provide them engaging things and engage them in the learning, they don't tend to focus on those other undesired behaviors that we see. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next one to give a couple of examples of just some concrete things that you can use to increase engagement. There's a couple of examples here. One, looking at the environment, looking at the things that are provided, the materials that provide representation, so things that are culturally appropriate for students, providing as much choice as possible. So it can be as simple as a choice board, choosing how what activity a student wants to engage in to learn the material, engage with the material. They can create their own plans. All of those things are really important to get students engaged, and it's going to be individually dependent. So things that engage one student might not engage a different student. So it is important to individualize that, which again is based on relationships and based on the mindsets of adults. And I'm going to breeze through this reflections because I took a little longer than I was supposed to on that section, and I want to make sure Eva has some time to get through her last little bit here.
Thanks, Tim. So the next couple minutes, we just wanted to do a little bit of a resource walk to show you where some of this information came from, and in case you were interested in digging in deeper. A lot of this information from today is part of a set of documents called Inclusive Strategies to Address Behavioral Needs for Students with IEPs. It is a web page on the DPI's website. And it has some additional topics that we didn't even get into, as well as goes a little deeper into the things that we did. So it does dig in deeper into the data to highlight the need for more inclusive strategies. It goes into establishing adult practices, talks a little bit more in depth about a response cycle. It does provide some supporting resources and more. And then each of the sections on this web page have some more reflection and application activities for adults as we start to strengthen our practices to better support students and their needs. And Tim, do you want to touch base on the DPI school-based mental health webpage?
Sure. So yeah, the school-based mental health information and resources live on the Student Services Prevention and Wellness team. We have several resources that we touched on a little bit today, including that social emotional learning framework and competencies. I'm sorry, a bird just flew right into my window. Okay, so we also have a recently published, I believe we first published it in the fall. We updated our school-based mental health framework, which includes a way to provide universal practices, selected practices, and intensive interventions to meet the mental health needs of all students, because we know, mental health, particularly recently in the last several years, has become a more prominent part of our world, and people are starting to recognize the mental health challenges. We know, mental health, positive mental health, and school success are tied together. So I would encourage you to check out our new school mental health framework. There's a lot of good resources, a lot of good strategies, a lot of good information on how to set up your system, again, to build relationships and allow students to be successful.
And then another resource for creating inclusive environments for all students is the Supporting Neurodiverse Students Professional Learning System. This is supported by an IDEA discretionary grant through DPI, and it includes regional training sessions, web-based events, a web-based toolkit, and other professional learning opportunities to support educators and families serving students with disability-related needs in the area of social and emotional learning. And another part of the Supporting Neurodiverse Students Professional Learning System at the bottom is the ES3 grant opportunity, and that's for districts, schools to apply, and then they receive, if they're selected, a 3-year grant. And that the goal of the ES3, the Enhancing Social Emotional Skills in Students with IEPs, the ES3 grant, is to provide public school districts with the structures and processes to identify and support the beliefs, skills, and systems needed to improve academic and functional outcomes for students who present with significantly divergent social and emotional learning needs. And that application is currently opened and will be open until, we'll be accepting applications until the end of this month, until the end of April. And there's also an application companion guide if you're interested in looking at that and considering if that might be important for you if you're in a school system.
Another important resource to point out is we've got several resources on culturally responsive practices. We have a very robust e-course called Promoting Excellence for All, which goes into very specific detail about culturally responsive practices, how to sort of disaggregate and analyze your data to support, again, all students. And we've also talked about this on an earlier slide today, the culturally responsive problem solving guide. Again, this is a resource that was authored primarily by Dr. Marquita Newell from Loyola University in Chicago. This is the guide that gets into those vulnerable decision points and the how to address and disrupt biases by really having an eye out for those untrue, unfounded, unalterable attributions to student behavior and focusing on the things that ways we can best support kids.
And then finally, as if we haven't had enough, an overwhelming amount of resources that you can dig into, we do have national organizations that are listed here, and they are also in that suite of information, the Inclusive Strategies suite of information. So there's lots of organizations that support the implementation of evidence-based practices for students with IEPs. And we do have kind of a curated list of resources in several places on the DPI webpage, but we have the high leverage practices in special education. Tim had mentioned the pyramid model, and from the pyramid model is a great set of resources called What Works Briefs, and that really goes into like really looking at specific skill needs of students and how adults can support those skills. And then we also have the National Center on Intensive Intervention, which provides resources on some behavior support for intensive intervention as well. And then I think our last slide is just a thank you very much for spending some time with us today. And always feel free to reach out to either of us with any questions that you might have on creating those inclusive environments, those supportive environments for students with IEPs.
Yep, that's the end of our resource walk. Yeah, important slide here that not only Eva and I, but we work with a lot of really good people with a lot of expertise at DPI. So we are another resource. So reach out to either Eva or I, and if we're not the right people to get you the information or support that you need, hopefully we know the person that we work with that does.
Well, thank you very much to the both of you, to Eva and to Tim. We don't have any other questions at this time. We have a bunch of thank yous that people are writing in the question box and saying thank you for the presentation today. I know that both of you presented a wealth of information, and I know that it'll be useful for all of the people who participated. So thank you to the both of you for your presentation today. This will conclude our webinar for today. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Please be reminded that Wisconsin Facets has over 100 scheduled trainings and webinars for the year 2022. And please feel free to check out our website calendar and register for any of those upcoming trainings that may be interesting to you. Also, please watch the short evaluation that will be coming your way after our live presentation today. Again, thank you, Eva, thank you, Tim, and thank you to all for your participation today. Everyone have a good day. Bye-bye.